Deep in a limestone cave, sealed away from sunlight for hundreds of thousands of years, something was waiting. When researchers finally lifted it out of the rock and dust, they expected another ordinary fossil, another small piece in the long puzzle of where we came from. Instead, they found a skull that simply refused to make sense. It had a jaw too heavy for a modern human, a brow ridge that belonged to something ancient, and yet a brain case large enough to rival our own. For a moment in that quiet cave, the entire timeline of human evolution seemed to wobble. This is the story of the skull that does not fit the human family tree, and why, decades later, scientists are still arguing about what it actually is. To understand why this discovery shook the world of paleoanthropology, you have to understand how fragile our picture of human origins really is. We like to imagine the story of humanity as a straight line, a tidy chain leading from ape-like ancestors through a series of increasingly upright, increasingly clever creatures, until finally, at the very end, us. Museum posters show this as a simple march of progress, a hunched figure gradually straightening its spine, shedding its hair, and picking up a spear. But real science has never looked like that poster. The actual fossil record is a scattered, broken, and often contradictory pile of bones, teeth, and skull fragments spread across 4 continents and separated by millions of years. Paleoanthropologists don't get a family tree handed to them. They get puzzle pieces from 1,000 different puzzles mixed together, with most of the pieces missing entirely. Every skull that gets pulled from the ground is a gamble. It might confirm what we already believe, or it might blow a hole straight through it. That is exactly what happened with this skull. When it was first examined, researchers ran through the usual checklist. Was it a modern human, Homo sapiens, like you and me? The brow ridge said no. Was it an archaic human ancestor, something like Homo erectus, the long-lived species that spread out of Africa nearly 2 million years ago? The braincase volume said no. Was it something entirely unknown, a branch of the family tree that had never been documented before? That possibility terrified some scientists and thrilled others because, if true, it meant our understanding of when and where different human species overlapped was seriously incomplete. The skull's proportions were the first red flag. In a typical, archaic human skull, the face is heavy, the forehead is low and sloped, and the back of the skull is elongated and low, almost like a loaf of bread lying on its side. In a typical modern human skull, the face is more delicate, the forehead rises steeply, and the brain case is rounded, almost balloon-like, sitting high above the eyes. This skull did neither. It had the heavy brow of an archaic hominin combined with a brain case size that crept into modern human territory. Imagine taking the face of a creature that lived 500,000 years ago and attaching it to the brain capacity of someone alive today. That mismatch is what made researchers stop in their tracks. Some scientists proposed the most obvious explanation first, that this was simply a case of unusual individual variation. Human anatomy is not printed from a single mold. Even today, if you lined up 1,000 human skulls, you would find enormous variation in brow ridge thickness, jaw size, and cranial shape. Perhaps this was simply an unusually robust individual from an otherwise known species, a statistical outlier rather than a new branch of humanity. This theory has a long history of being right. Time and again in the story of paleoanthropology, a single strange bone has been hastily declared a new species, only for decades of further digging to reveal it was simply an extreme example of natural variation within a species we already knew. But the more researchers studied this particular skull, the harder that explanation became to defend. The anomalies were not limited to one feature. It wasn't just a thick brow ridge on an otherwise normal head. Multiple traits across multiple regions of the skull pointed in conflicting directions at the same time. The shape of the nasal opening resembled one group. The structure of the cheekbones resembled another. The thickness of the cranial bone told yet another story. When you have one strange feature, you can chalk it up to individual variation. When you have 5 or 6 strange features that don't belong together in any known population, living or extinct, you start to suspect you are looking at something genuinely new, or something that resulted from an event far stranger than typical biological variation. That is when the more provocative theories entered the conversation. One idea, and one of the most compelling to many researchers, was interbreeding. We now know, thanks to breakthroughs in ancient DNA analysis over the past 15 years, that different human species were not living in isolated bubbles, cleanly replacing one another in a straight line of succession. They were living alongside each other, sometimes for tens of thousands of years, in overlapping territories. And more than that, they were interbreeding. Modern humans carry Neanderthal DNA in their genomes today, sometimes several % of a person's total genetic makeup. Populations in Asia and Oceania carry DNA from an entirely separate archaic group known as the Denisovans, a population we know almost entirely from a handful of bone fragments and teeth found in a single Siberian cave, because we have almost no complete skeletal remains of them at all. If Neanderthals and Denisovans could interbreed with early modern humans and leave a genetic legacy that persists in living people today, then it stands to reason that skeletal remains showing a mixture of archaic and modern traits could be the physical evidence of exactly that kind of interbreeding. A hybrid individual, born from parents belonging to different human species, might carry a skull that looks like nothing else in the fossil record, because it wouldn't be a pure example of either lineage. It would be something in between, a living blend of 2 different chapters of the human story, fossilized in bone. This idea, once considered fringe, has gained enormous credibility in the scientific mainstream. Interbreeding between hominin species is no longer a controversial fringe theory whispered about at conferences. It's established, peer-reviewed, and confirmed through direct genetic sequencing. The real debate now isn't whether interbreeding happened, but how common it was, and how many strange, hard-to-classify fossils in museum drawers around the world might actually be hybrid individuals rather than new species or simple anomalies. Before we go further, if this kind of deep dive into the mysteries hiding in the fossil record is the kind of thing you enjoy, now is the perfect moment to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. There are more stories like this one waiting, discoveries that quietly rewrote textbook skulls and bones that scientists still argue about behind closed doors. Subscribing means you won't miss the next one, and if you're already enjoying this video, drop a comment below telling me what you think this skull actually is. Your theory might be more accurate than you realize. Now back to the mystery. Another theory researchers seriously considered was something called mosaic evolution. This is the idea that different parts of the human body and even different parts of the skull do not evolve at the same speed. Evolution isn't a single dial that turns uniformly across an entire organism. It's more like dozens of separate dials, each controlled by different genetic and environmental pressures, each turning at its own pace. Brain size might increase relatively quickly in a population due to selective pressures favoring intelligence, problem solving, or social cooperation, While the face and jaw, shaped by different pressures related to diet and chewing mechanics, might lag behind, retaining older, more archaic features for much longer. Under this theory, the skull isn't a hybrid between two species, and it isn't a simple outlier. It's a snapshot of evolution itself caught in the act, a population transitioning from one form to another, with some traits already advanced and others still holding on to the past. If true, this skull becomes one of the most valuable fossils ever found, not because it breaks the family tree, but because it shows us the family tree branching in real time, a transitional form frozen mid-transformation. The dating of the skull only deepened the mystery. Using a combination of techniques, including uranium series dating on surrounding sediment and, where possible, direct analysis of the bone itself, researchers place the skull at a point in time when multiple human species are known to have coexisted in the same general region. This wasn't a skull discovered in isolation, floating in some impossible timeline. It came from a period of genuine overlap, a genuine crossroads in human history, when archaic populations and more modern populations were living close enough that contact, competition, and yes, interbreeding were all entirely plausible. That context matters enormously. A strange skull found in complete isolation, with no other evidence of overlapping populations nearby, is much harder to explain. But a strange skull found precisely where and when we already suspect different human groups were mingling becomes far more than a curiosity. It becomes potential physical evidence for exactly the kind of contact scientists had only inferred from genetics before. Of course, not every researcher was convinced. Science thrives on disagreement, and this skull became a genuine point of contention within the field. Some paleoanthropologists argued that without a complete, undisputed genetic sample extracted directly from the bone itself, all of this remains educated speculation. Ancient DNA is notoriously difficult to extract and sequence, especially from remains that are tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years old, remains that have been exposed to heat, humidity, or mineral saturation that degrades genetic material over time. Without that direct genetic confirmation, critics argued we are left interpreting shape and structure alone, and human beings have a long, well-documented history of seeing patterns, narratives, and stories in bones that may simply be ambiguous. The skull could be an unusual individual. It could be a population variant we simply haven't documented well enough yet. It could even be the result of pathology, some developmental condition that altered normal growth patterns in ways that mimic archaic traits without any deeper evolutionary significance at all. Conditions affecting bone growth, hormone regulation, or even nutrition during childhood development can dramatically alter skull shape in ways that have nothing to do with species or ancestry. This is the tension that makes paleoanthropology such a compelling and often frustrating field of science. A single skull, a single fragment of bone, can support multiple entirely different narratives, and short of finding a perfectly preserved, uncontaminated genetic sample, researchers may never reach complete consensus. What one scientist calls compelling evidence of hybridization, another calls insufficient data stretched to fit a preferred conclusion. Both scientists can be looking at the exact same measurements, the exact same photographs, the exact same cranial capacity figures, and walk away with opposite interpretations. That's not a flaw in the science. That's what real science, conducted honestly and rigorously, actually looks like when the evidence is genuinely ambiguous. What makes this particular skull so significant, regardless of which theory eventually wins out, is what it represents about the limits of our confidence. For most of the 20th century, the public was presented with a clean, linear story of human evolution, a story with clear stages, clear species, and clear transitions from one to the next. But every major discovery over the past few decades has chipped away at that simplicity. The discovery of the Denisovans from nothing more than a finger bone and a few teeth, the discovery of Homo naledi deep in a South African cave system, a species with a brain the size of an orange that somehow appears to have deliberately placed its dead in a location almost impossible to reach without tools or fire. The discovery of Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit species, standing barely a meter tall, found on a remote Indonesian island, and initially dismissed by many scientists as a diseased modern human, before further evidence forced a reconsideration. Each of these discoveries did exactly what this skull is doing now. They complicated a story that people wanted to be simple. They forced professional scientists, not just the public, to admit that our family tree looks less like a single trunk with clean branches and more like a tangled, overlapping thicket with species diverging, reconnecting, interbreeding, and going extinct in patterns we are only beginning to reconstruct. There's something genuinely humbling in that. We often talk about human evolution as though it were a finished story, something settled in textbooks decades ago, with modern science simply filling in minor details around the edges. But the truth is far messier and honestly far more interesting. We are still discovering entirely new species of ancient humans. We are still finding skulls that don't fit into any existing category. We are still rewriting sections of the story that were once considered closed. Every few years, a new fossil forces yet another revision, another asterisk, another acknowledgement that the full picture is more complicated than anyone previously assumed. This particular skull is simply the most recent and one of the most striking examples of that ongoing process. It sits in a research collection today, still debated, still measured and remeasured, still photographed from every angle by researchers hoping new technology or new comparative data might finally settle the question of exactly what it is. Some scientists continue to hold out hope that with advancing techniques, particularly in ancient protein analysis, a field that can sometimes recover biological information, even when DNA has fully degraded, this skull might eventually give up its secrets completely. Protein analysis has already helped identify species from fragments too old and too degraded for traditional DNA extraction, opening a new frontier in paleoanthropology that didn't exist even 15 years ago. If researchers can successfully extract and analyze proteins from this skull, they may finally be able to place it definitively on the family tree, confirming whether it represents a hybrid individual, a previously undocumented population, or something else entirely that current theories haven't even considered yet. Until that day comes, this skull remains exactly what its story suggests, a genuine mystery sitting at the crossroads of human origins, a physical reminder that the story of where we came from is nowhere near as settled as we like to believe. It challenges the comfortable linear narrative most of us grew up with and replaces it with something far closer to the truth, a messy, branching, overlapping history full of populations meeting, mixing, diverging, and disappearing, leaving behind only scattered fragments for future generations to piece back together. Every strange skull like this one is a reminder that the human story is still being written, not by us, but by the bones themselves, waiting patiently in the ground for someone to finally understand what they're trying to say. If this journey into the strangest corners of human origins fascinated you as much as it fascinated me putting it together, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps this content reach more curious minds like yours, and it lets me keep making deep dives into the discoveries that quietly rewrite what we think we know about ourselves. Let me know in the comments which theory you find most convincing: hybridization, mosaic evolution, or something else entirely, and tell me what ancient mystery you want covered next.